avoid the worst destruction. Jeremiah 52. Dear brothers and sisters, Judah and Jerusalem faced the most dreadful destruction. The nation of Judah went through 4 stages of downfall. The first was in 605 BC, in the days of King Jehoiakim, when some were taken captive to Babylon. The second was in 597, in the first year of King Jehoiakim. The third was in 586, in the 11th year of King Zedekiah, when Jerusalem was destroyed. And then in 584, 2 years after the fall of Jerusalem, there was an additional deportation. At first, Babylon only took certain people into captivity, but later, in the third and additional deportations, Judah's authority and sovereignty were completely destroyed. They experienced the very worst destruction. Was it God's plan from the beginning to bring Judah to total collapse? No, it was not. If complete destruction had been his original plan, he would not have sent his message through Jeremiah, saying, "Surrender to Babylon, do not rely on Egypt." God gave his word in order to prevent Judah from falling into the worst destruction. Then, why did the nation still face such a dreadful end? Because they rejected God's warnings. Though judgment itself could not be avoided, they still could have escaped the worst of it. My prayer is that we too may receive grace to avoid the worst destruction. Ignoring repeated warnings leads to the worst destruction. In the days of King Zedekiah, before Jerusalem completely fell, there had already been several stages of captivity. A nation does not fall in one moment. There were already first and second warnings. Through earlier exiles, Babylon's power continued to grow and press down on Judah. So, what choice should Zedekiah have made? He was set up as king by Babylon. So at first he followed a pro-Babylon policy. But as time passed, the voices for Egypt grew louder. The pro-Egypt party pressed the king to change direction. Finally, he leaned toward Egypt. The result was tragic. Babylon struck back. They captured Jerusalem, blinded King Zedekiah, killed his sons, destroyed the officials, and burned the temple. 2 years later, even more people were carried into exile. Judah's sovereignty was completely crushed. Beloved, this happened because Judah did not accept God's repeated warnings. I too have experienced God's warnings in my body. In my 20s, a blood test after donating blood showed a problem. My liver enzymes were high. That was the first warning. Later, while serving in ministry with many meals and meetings, I gained over 20 kilograms. My liver enzymes climbed higher, up to 150 and even 180. Chronic fatigue, indigestion and pain followed. That was the second warning. By God's mercy, after I planted this church, I lost weight, exercised, and my health improved. Yes, some problems remain, but at least the progress toward something worse has been stopped. Beloved, when God gives us first and second warnings, we must never treat them lightly. If we continue to ignore them, the next stage may be irreversible, the worst destruction. Do not rely on Egypt. Why did Judah keep depending on Egypt? Even in the wilderness, after coming out of slavery, the people cried, "Let us go back to Egypt." Why? Because in Egypt there were many gods to choose from. People could worship whichever god suited their desires and live as they pleased. But faith in God is different. God says, "Wait, endure, be holy, do not act recklessly." Faith in God often feels uncomfortable. That is why the people longed for Egypt. It allowed them to live however they wanted. Beloved, the habits and temptations of Egypt must be thrown away. The way of Egypt is to believe as you please and live as you please. But the first step of true faith is to stand still before God, to endure and to wait. Many people think standing still will kill them, but the way of life is to be trained to endure in God's presence. Accept Babylon as God's judgment. Why did God use Babylon as his instrument of judgment and not Egypt? Because relying on Egypt meant Judah could still keep its throne and sovereignty, but Babylon took away political power. Yet, under Babylon, the people were still free to keep their religion and culture. That is why, even in exile, they could continue to live by faith in God. In fact, during the exile, their faith became stronger. Beloved, what matters before God is not worldly authority or sovereignty, but living as citizens of his kingdom. That is why he told Judah to accept Babylon rather than cling to Egypt. Think about our own history. After the war, North Korea oppressed faith, forcing its people to live only by communist ideology. As a result, the nation became closed, poor, and oppressed. South Korea, however, walked the path of freedom and faith. The result is a nation that, by God's grace, has grown into one of the most prosperous in the world. Avoid the worst destruction. Judah did not collapse in one moment. There were first and second exiles, warnings from God, but they ignored them, and so they fell into the worst irreversible destruction. Beloved, what warnings are you hearing today? In your health, your habits, your thoughts, or your family life? Are there signs of Egypt in you? Do not ignore them. Remove them. Accept God's discipline. And by His grace, may you live faithfully and may you avoid the worst destruction. Amen.